Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire I'm going to step outside my normal lane, so stick with me on FlyWire. I've gotten lots of comments on the final report update for this accident. Some are good and some are pissed. What I can tell from the ones that are pissed are seem to be mostly from folks who have a particular affinity for other YouTubers. Okay, fine, whatever they have to say, that's their thing. But I typically don't add material to a video based on comments. But in this case, I think I'm going to do that. I think it's important. So, based on the negative comments, the folks that are, based on that, the folks are losing focus on what is important here. Okay, so here goes. From my perspective, the most important issue here is the operating below the MDA. Witnesses said the caravan popped out of the cloud. It was supposedly at 2300, that was the report, the base of the first broken layer, and then immediately went into a steam cloud. Okay, and the aircraft performance report for the NTSB investigation, they did not count the the reported steam cloud at all, and the first view of the runway was about 40 seconds prior to the impact, and the rest of the time it was obscured by the dash, physical interference, until approximately 2 seconds prior to impact. Okay, my most important point here is that if the pilot flew into a steam cloud and was below the MDA, then the only choice was to go missed approach at that point. If you lose visual contact with the runway, its environment, lights, etc., you go around. You go missed approach, full stop. The other thing that is a requirement for the aircraft to be continuously in a position from which a descent to landing can be made using normal rate of descent and normal maneuvers. At the point of impact, the aircraft was 316 feet below the MDA and 112 feet below the nominal vertical descent angle. It's not a glide path in this point. It's not a precision approach. It's a visual segment after the MDA. This was a non-precision approach, and the VDA is more of a visual procedure than an instrument one. Okay, so visual is an issue here. At the point of impact, the aircraft was 86 feet above the ground and only 46 feet above the threshold crossing height, with 4/10 of a mile, 2,632 feet actually, to fly. I'm sorry, but that's not a normal rate of descent or normal procedure to land on a runway. In my opinion, the missed approach was warranted. You may disagree, and that's fine. If the pilot flew into a steam cloud, the visual contact was lost, continuing the approach, I think, is no longer legal. You're entitled to your own opinion, and that's fine. I think the reason should be obvious at this point about why you can't continue because of the obstacles that you might run into. How did the pilot get into this situation? Frankly, I must admit it stuns me that any of these smokestacks were located coincident with the final approach segment to runway 20. And the two reports that two studies the FAA made concerning this issue, they determined that there were 18 separate structures that penetrated the runway 20 approach surfaces, varying anywhere from 18 to 37 feet into the protected zone. The accident stack was in the middle of that group at 23 feet. It wasn't the highest, but it was directly in line with the runway, and the others were just slightly off that direct line. This created the worst possible situation in low visibility approach, and I'm sure the courts will fight it out, and maybe hazards to navigation like these will be eradicated as a result. Blame will be allocated. That's in court. That's not what we need to learn from this accident. Okay. From here on, the existence of the stacks and the penetration into the protected airspace are not material to the analysis. Frankly, we as pilots need to learn what went wrong and how we can avoid this situation ourselves. Okay. I'm not a subject matter expert for the lawsuit in this case. I wouldn't talk about it if I was. That's the whole point we do these analyses, is to find out what went wrong and how we can avoid it in the future. The ground at the stack was 4,157.8 feet MSL, and the top of the stack was 4,257.8 feet MSL. It's 100 feet. The aircraft performance investigator observed that the stack to be, as I said, 2,632 feet from the runway 20 threshold, 0.4 of a mile. During simulation testing, he observed the stack to be visible to the pilot approximately 2 seconds prior to impact, and noted the red light was at the same level as the threshold lights. I still maintain that the light played no factor in this accident and was not likely to be seen in any case. If it was a white strobe, the fact that it was visible for only 2 seconds would not have left any time to maneuver or avoid it. 86 feet above the ground, my gosh. Any radical maneuver more than about 10 or 15 degrees of bank, that's pretty radical. You're not going to avoid that prior to impact. It is debatable what the impact would be at first look emerging from the clouds, 40 some odd seconds before that. But speaking about that steam cloud, the notion that density altitude was a factor. In my experience, the real issue with smokestacks is turbulence. Significant wind shears can exist around stacks, and that makes them more of a hazard to navigation than their height. You can actually get an upset from that kind of turbulence, very violent. The effects of turbulence are persistent because of the violent displacement of air volumes, and that takes time and distance to dissipate. Temperatures, on the other hand, that's what we're talking about, density altitude. Temperature of the gas cloud itself are not long-term. It's a physics thing. I'm not going to do the math for you right now. I don't want you to tune off. But again, referring to the aircraft performance report, the investigator looked at the DA issue and using an EPA-provided software product was able to determine that any DA effect would be minimal. The temperature of the steam cloud would be 99.7% of ambient outside of 200 feet. So if there was any DA effect, it would be within 200 feet of the stack that was emitting the steam. And therefore, when I read through it, I discarded it, the whole notion as not applicable. The investigator looked closely at both approaches and determined, however, that there was a significant change in descent rates in the final seconds prior to impact on the accident approach, the second approach. Juan Brown noted this and posted the DA situation inside the cloud, or posited that DA situation inside of the cloud. I didn't think it was a factor, and I neglected to point out the investigation's findings because of that reason, because I didn't think it was a factor. To me, it all boils down to being too low, and when the visual contact was lost, a missed approach should have been executed. But I'll admit here that I was not as thorough as I should have been, okay? So what happened? Using the ADS-B and the tower impact video to compute a profile that fits the data points, the physical data points that they have, the ADS-B message, and they have the exact time and altitude, etc., for the impact. The investigator compared both approaches, and the first approach was 20 to 50 knots faster than the second. Both were done with flaps up. An argument could be made that both approaches were done in icing conditions, and then the book recommended configurations are 95 knots flaps up and 85 knots flaps 10 to 20 degrees. Okay, important point here. He also noted that given the contaminated runway and the length, it was unlikely that the airplane could land and stop on the available runway using icing condition recommendations. Okay, that's a huge point. So it appears that the pilot was trying to fly an approach that would result in not running off the end of the runway. She was flaps up, but she was slow. The primary result of flying slower without flaps results in a higher deck angles, higher angle of attack. So in other words, a larger coefficient of lift. That complicates the pilot's ability to maintain side of the runway because you got a higher deck angle. Okay, you're slower and you're higher, you're trying to maintain visual. On the accident approach, the indicated airspeed was computed to be 84 to 86 knots and steady for the last 26 seconds of flight. At 8:32 even, just passing Jamid, the intermediate point on the approach at 4,800 feet MSL, there was an increase in pitch angle with 80 knots true airspeed. That was computed. Referring to the results of the simulation flights done, the investigator believes that the pitch change was done to keep the runway in sight at the edge of the glare shield. Just 15 seconds later, when the indicated speed had decayed to 85 knots, then there was a significant decrease in pitch angle. significant decrease in pitch angle. That resulted in the descent rate increasing to nearly 1,100 feet per minute. Juan got that correct. An increase of about 600 feet per minute. Impact was just over 11 seconds later. In my math, that results to a loss of about 100 feet or so. And that's pretty significant, and I missed it, sorry. The investigator speculates that this pitch change was likely due to the activation of the stall warning horn. The activation range is 5 to 10 knots above the actual stall, and that 85 knots in that configuration was right in that green zone, in that zone. The impact occurred at 76 knot ground speed. The pitch change, due possibly to that stall warning, would account for most of the aircraft's deviance below the nominal glide path, vertical descent angle that she should have been, okay? It was 98 feet, the top of the stack was 98 feet below that glide path, vertical descent angle. The RNAV 20 approach to BYI in those conditions certainly was a trap, especially given the contamination, and then using icing conditions configurations would likely result in running off the runway. Please note that the FAA does not allow you to depend on thrust reversers or beta thrust to achieve stopping distance. You have to compete it with normal brakes. And using the beta, she probably could have done it, but she questionable legality for doing that. The pilot elected to fly a slower approach. That was her solution. That resulted in a higher deck angle, complicating the pilot's ability to keep the runway in sight, and possibly received a stall warning that resulted in an increase in descent rate at a very unfortunate time. Perhaps Mad Mac 37 said it best about getting behind the power curve in a heartbeat. It happened in a heartbeat. For me, the takeaway is still the missed approach, especially if a stall warning was received on final. Hey, something's really screwed up. My goal is not to hit the ground or anything attached to it, and then that close to the ground, I'm going to go around. And I wish she had done the same thing. Oh, by the way, it might be a good idea to send critiques of any other poorly designed approaches out there that you may run into. You never know when it might save a fellow pilot and their family a lot of grief. Well, there you have it. That's my updates. Keep those comments coming. Thanks for watching. Even if you disagree, I don't care. I'll see you next time on FlyWire.